So what do we have? We have no one having a means to deal with such cases. For instance, the horrors at Virginia Tech, where no one could answer back or even have a chance to reduce the mayhem. No, it all had to wait for law enforcement to arrive after it was all over and 32 were dead. On the subject of law enforcement, much as I greatly respect the unenviable job of the police officer, let's be clear, even with the fastest response times and assuming a victim even has had a chance to call 911, a delay of maybe 4 minutes or more is plenty time enough for a bad guy to have shot his victims and escaped. Law enforcement can arrive and in essence just string out the crime scene tape, measure up the bodies and wait for the coroner. To protect and serve may be the law enforcement motto, but that doesn't confer any special protection on the individual. How could it? It's a broad statement at best. Let's consider a scenario, simple one. An unarmed good guy walks to his local 7-Eleven to buy some milk, but before he gets there he's accosted by an armed bad guy who wants his money. Now, high-level police policy tells the good guy to do what he's told and yield to the robbery. But that does not take into account the very definite possibility that a robber may shoot anyway. He often wants no witnesses and has few scruples. So, with no means of self-defence with any teeth, and most likely no chance to summon help, the only chance the good guy might have would have been if he was also armed. The ability to fight fire with fire. "Guns are bad!" cry out so many. No, some people are bad. Place a loaded gun on a table and watch it. Does it go bang? No, it does not, without input from a user to employ it for good or evil. That reminds me of an old cartoon that's still around. Never mind the dog, but beware the owner. Yes, the user is the critical factor, and someone with evil intent will also use pretty much any tool as a weapon against another, whether a gun, knife or blunt object. Bad guys have plenty of ways of injuring and killing. Getting guns off the streets, is another classic we hear so often, such as promoted by certain mayors and anti-gun groups. Typical examples being New York City, Chicago, and of course we mustn't forget DC. This quaint notion that depriving honest citizens of their guns will by some miracle change the city crime figures and homicides. It's flawed, totally. Naive isn't even in it. Few, if any, gang members are law-abiding, and yet most homicides are produced by those very people. If we remember and accept the logic that the bad guys are in effect immune from disarmament, where does this leave the honest Joe? Yes, unarmed and vulnerable, with no means of adequate self-protection if banned from owning a gun. Perhaps the DC situation has been the most absurd, whereby even a long arm, I believe, was supposedly only to be kept disassembled. We should follow on with the decision of the Heller versus DC case in June 2008. Because while superficially it has seemed as though the Second Amendment was indeed allowed to be seen as an individual right, and this was a shaky vote at best with a 5-4 result, in the end, by the time the word reasonable was introduced to help reinforce the future decisions on what might or might not be judged okay, we see that the Second Amendment was not actually strengthened, more likely it was weakened, with doors being left open to we know not what, in the name of reasonable. I mean, who decides on reasonable? Probably not Joe Schmo, that's for sure. All manner of dangers can come from this, and I know that my reasonable, for sure, does not match a liberal thinking anti-gun person's reasonable. Let's apply their reasonable to types or varieties of firearms, as they often want to do. A semi-auto must have a restricted magazine capacity. 10 rounds maximum is just acceptable. Anything more is bad. Firepower, don't you know? A 50 caliber rifle. Too much gun. No way does anyone need such a dangerous thing that can even, gasp, bring down an aeroplane. Assault weapons. These have no place in civilian hands. They're too dangerous and too military in type. And so the list goes on. Well, folks, remember that any or all of these guns can and will be obtained by criminals due to inevitable and uncontrolled availability. So, limiting these in legal private ownership will achieve little other than cutting across Second Amendment rights and depriving honest folks of their free choice. No sooner was the Heller versus DC case over with than Heller and others sought to go register their handguns. Only it seems to be totally stonewalled by the DC weasels, who, being knowingly unlawful and unconstitutional, still sought to either bar someone or state that a gun could only be kept in the home with a trigger lock, unloaded and even disassembled. Yeah, great. So if a bad guy comes in armed, he has to wait while the victim gets his gun ready to use. That's good. Their attitude is seemingly, we know we're not obeying the court decision or the Second Amendment, but so what? Sue us if you wish. Isn't that great? And so it goes on. As for concealed carry, well, forget that of course, despite DC having an absurd record for shooting crimes by criminals. Let's add another thing too, media bias. You can be sure to hear about shootings of pretty much any type, usually where bad guys kill or maim. But how many times do we hear about legitimate use of firearms in self-defense by the good guys? Hardly at all. It gets somehow left out. Not to mention the fact that the vast majority of times the mere presence of a gun in a good guy's hands is enough to deter a bad result. Way more often than when shots are actually fired. Oh yeah, it's very convenient to forget this. Who generates this bias anyway? I'm not totally sure, but I'm guessing that the powers that be, the liberal bosses, do not want to be seen as remotely gun-friendly, and so they stifle most good gun reporting, much preferring also to label semi-automatic rifles as assault weapons, as if they're machine guns, and always damning the gun itself as an entity. I come back once more to one of my prime questions. Do anti-gun people seriously believe that bans on legitimate ownership will solve crime and gun violence? Well, sadly, it seems they do, or they pretend to, in order to try and achieve their goal of control. Yeah, people control. In fact, if raw logic is applied to this question, the answer is most definitely hell no. Australia and the UK, with all their gun bans, have seen increased violence, including shootings, not less. And yet for people in those countries there is little option to have a viable tool for self-defense at all. In fact, it would seem sometimes that the original victim of a crime is not a victim at all if he defends himself. He becomes a perpetrator and bad guy himself and then gets arrested. Well, there's more, lots more, but suffice it to say that the gun owner these days is a beleaguered species, carrying more and more stigma as the Second Amendment continues to be under constant attack and erosion. Even the out-of-control Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives is trying its very best too. Overfunded, overpowerful and under-policed. Accountability is out of the window as they practice abuses and violations, trying to close down dealers and pounce on innocent owners with trumped-up charges. They still decide how they want to interpret the law and the Constitution to suit their own ends, with no real system for testing that is consistent or even recorded on video. No, they do what they like to gain convictions, and Congress still, it seems, turns a blind eye. That is totally despicable. It's worth noting in closing that those in power, law enforcement, etc., have to take an oath of office, within which is a swearing to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America. Sadly, this seems to be conveniently forgotten, and so they, in effect, and technically at least in my book, become criminal when flouting that oath. But who is policing the police, Again, where is accountability? All but non-existent, and the word Constitution has become a dirty word in high places, like the word patriot. Oh well, thanks for listening to this old man, who sees way too much heading for, if not actually going right down, the proverbial toilet.